Early on a Saturday morning in April, 3 years after her grandfather's death, 17-year-old Nora Hayes parked the tractor at the edge of her family's bottomland and did something her neighbor across the fence line had never once seen a Hayes do in 40 years of farming next to them. She didn't plow. Wade Collins was already out checking his own fence when he saw her circle the low 20 acres and leave it standing. Tall grass, scattered wildflowers, ground every other farm in the valley would have had turned black and bare by now. He leaned on the rail and called over before she'd even shut the tractor down. "You know you're getting paid by the acre, right?" Nora didn't answer right away. She had an old notebook sitting on the tractor seat beside her, her grandfather's, found in a roll-top desk nobody had cleared out since he died. Its pages full of decades of ordinary farm records except for one line, underlined twice in his own hand, that she still didn't fully understand. "Whatever you do, don't turn the low ground." She trusted him enough to obey it anyway. Her father hadn't argued when she told him her plan, mostly because he no longer had the strength most mornings to argue about much of anything. And some part of Nora understood that the decision, whether it turned out to be wisdom or foolishness, belonged to her alone now, in a way 17-year-olds weren't usually asked to carry. "I'm not farming it," she finally told Wade. "Not the way you mean." He laughed, the way a man laughs at something he's confident time will prove wrong for him. 20 acres of what looked, to every farmer in the valley, like nothing more than a girl too stubborn or too sentimental to let go of an old man's strange habit. What Nora's grandfather had actually been protecting underneath that grass, and why he'd spent the last 20 years of his life quietly guarding a secret he never fully explained to anyone, not even her, wouldn't become clear until the sky over Ash Creek turned the color of iron and didn't stop for 4 days straight. As you watch, see if you can figure out what one stubborn strip of unploughed ground was really doing out there, because by the time the water came, it wasn't just Nora's farm that needed it. Nora's father, Roy, had never been the same after her grandfather Elmer died. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but a kind of tiredness that had settled into him the way weather settles into old joints, making decisions feel heavier than they used to. He'd handed most of the farm's day-to-day choices to Nora without ever formally saying so, the way a man does when he's not entirely sure he trusts his own judgment anymore and hasn't found a graceful way to admit it. "Your grandfather wasn't a fool," Roy told her, the evening she first mentioned the notebook. "But he wasn't always right either. Man got stubborn about that low ground for reasons he never once explained to me, and I farmed beside him 30 years. Did you ever ask him?" "Once or twice. He'd just say the ground knew things we didn't, and change the subject." Roy shook his head. Sounded like an old man talking in riddles most days. "I let it go rather than push him on it." Nora hadn't let it go. She'd read the notebook enough evenings by then that Elmer's handwriting had started to feel less like a stranger's and more like a voice she was slowly learning to understand, one entry at a time. The mockery at the co-op started within the week. Once word got around that the youngest Hayes had left 20 acres of prime bottomland standing in weeds. Nora had gone in for feed and found herself, before she'd even reached the counter, the subject of a conversation 3 men had clearly already been having without her. "There she is," one of them said, an older farmer named Gus Pruitt who'd known her grandfather most of his life. "Nora, tell me straight, you farming that low ground, or keeping a lawn?" A couple of the others laughed. Nora set her feed sack down on the counter, more evenly than she felt. "It's producing something. Just not corn. Producing weeds," Gus said, not unkindly, more the tone of a man who genuinely believed he was doing her a favor by saying it out loud. "Your granddaddy let that habit get away from him toward the end, I always figured. Nobody faulted him for it. Man's earned the right to farm however he pleases once he's put in 40 years. But you're 17, Nora. You've got a whole career of decisions ahead of you, and starting it off leaving good ground fallow isn't the reputation you want to build." Another man, younger, offered to buy the section outright before she left, not unkindly either, since a girl her age surely had better use for the money than pride. She refused both times, evenly, and walked out with her feed sack without giving either of them the satisfaction of an argument. She sat in the truck a while afterward before starting the engine, more shaken by the exchange than she wanted to admit, and drove home with the notebook on the seat beside her the whole way, checking it at every stop sign like it might have new answers in it since that morning. The more pressure she got, the more she found herself digging into it for anything that might explain why her grandfather had cared enough to leave that ground untouched for the last 20 years of his life. She found the first real clue walking the low ground itself, 3 weeks into spring. On an evening, she'd only gone out to check the fence line before dark. Something in the grass caught her eye that she'd walked past 100 times without really seeing. Shallow ridges running across the slope, spaced too regularly to be anything but built rather than natural, visible only because the low evening light threw long shadows across ground that looked flat in full daylight. She came back the next morning with a hand shovel, more curious than purposeful, and knelt in wet grass to dig into the nearest ridge. The sod came up easily enough, root-bound and thick, and beneath it her shovel struck something that resisted in a way ordinary dirt didn't. She cleared it by hand, fingers working through cool, damp soil, until she'd exposed a flat stone laid deliberately on its edge, packed tight against others just like it. Then another, a few feet on. Then a third, running the same general direction, clearly part of something larger than a single ridge, a buried line of stonework extending further than she could see from where she knelt, disappearing under grass that had grown over it so completely it had become, for most of a century, simply part of the landscape. She sat back on her heels, dirt under her nails, and felt something shift in how she understood the 20 acres she'd been defending on instinct alone for 3 weeks. She checked the notebook that evening with new eyes, rereading entries she'd skimmed past before. The East Swale, the Lower Basin, the Old Spill, never blocked the water's road. Elmer had never explained any of those phrases outright, but reading them now, against stones she'd just pulled out of the ground with her own hands, they stopped sounding like an old man's private shorthand and started sounding like a map. The county records office in town kept survey documents going back further than Nora expected, and a patient clerk named Mrs. Iverson pulled an old 1911 plat map for her, without much difficulty, the paper gone soft and brown at the edges. Your family's place was part of a bigger settlement back then, Mrs. Iverson said, tracing a faded boundary line with one finger. This whole stretch of bottomland used to flood something terrible before anybody built levees. Way I understand it, the original farmers didn't fight the water so much as give it somewhere to go. Upper fields slowed it down, the low grassland soaked it up, and a run of shallow channels carried the rest toward a wetland at the bottom of the valley. She looked up at Nora. Wasn't uncommon, that kind of system, before everybody got modern equipment and started straightening every field into neat rows. Most of it got plowed under or filled in decades ago. Didn't figure anybody still had a working piece of it left. My grandfather did, Nora said, and understood, sitting there in that quiet records office, that the 20 acres everyone in the valley considered wasted ground might be the last surviving piece of something built more than a century earlier. The emotional reason came from her Aunt Patty, Elmer's younger sister, over coffee one Sunday afternoon that Nora had specifically driven out to ask about. Patty lived alone in a small house at the edge of town now, 71 years old and sharp as anyone Nora knew, and she'd gone quiet for a moment when Nora set the notebook on the kitchen table between them. Haven't seen his handwriting in a while, Patty said, running a thumb along the cover before opening it. Where'd you find this? Roll-top desk. Nobody'd cleared it out. Patty read a few pages in silence, long enough that Nora started to wonder if she'd overstepped by bringing it. Finally, Patty set it down and looked at her. 1978, she said. Worst flood this valley ever saw, before or since. Took Wade's father's whole crop. The Hendersons lost their barn. 3 families never did rebuild proper. Your grandfather was young then, barely older than you are now, and everybody said the Hayes place should have gone under just as bad as everybody else's. But it didn't. Didn't lose hardly anything, far as anybody could explain at the time. Patty wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, looking out the window rather than at Nora. I remember him coming in from checking the fields that week, mud to his knees, saying almost nothing at all. Elmer never made much of it publicly, didn't want folks thinking he was bragging while neighbors were losing everything. And there was some guilt in it too, I think, surviving something that took so much from people he'd known his whole life. But I know it changed something in him. He started leaving pieces of the low ground unploughed not long after, a little more every few years, and when people asked why, He'd just say he was keeping something the valley might need again someday. Patty shook her head slowly. Nobody took him seriously. Modern farming was more profitable, and a man protecting 20 acres of weeds looked like sentiment more than sense to folks who hadn't watched what that ground did in '78. Why didn't he ever explain it properly? Even to Dad, Patty considered that a long moment. Some men carry a thing so long. Explaining it starts to feel harder than just carrying it. I think your grandfather got so used to nobody believing him, he stopped trying to make anybody understand. Just kept doing the work quiet, and figured somebody would either notice or they wouldn't. He'd known. He just never told anyone the whole of it, not even his own son, and Nora understood, driving home that afternoon, that whatever answers were left to find, she was going to have to find them mostly on her own. Restoring what was left of the old system became Nora's project through the rest of that spring, done slowly and mostly by hand, because there wasn't money for anything else. She cleared blocked sections of the old stone channels with a shovel and her own 2 hands, hauling brush and silled out by wheelbarrow load after load, her shoulders and forearms aching in a way schoolwork had never once asked of her. She planted native grasses along the bare patches Elmer had never gotten around to restoring himself. She left the lowland alone entirely, resisting every instinct that told her and used ground was wasted ground. For the cover crop covering most of the 20 acres, she used a technique she'd read about in one of her grandfather's newer notebooks, tucked behind the older one, a heavy steel roller, rust-scarred but still functional, that she pulled behind the farm's old low-horsepower tractor to crimp and flatten the tall rye and clover into a thick mat instead of tilling it under. The work was slow and exhausting, hours at a time rolling back and forth across ground that looked, by the time she finished each pass, less like a farm and more like a field somebody had simply given up on. There was a specific bad afternoon in late May when the old tractor's belt slipped twice within an hour, and Nora sat on the hitch in the heat, greasy to the elbows, close enough to tears that she let herself have exactly 2 minutes of it before getting back to work, because there wasn't anybody coming to finish the job for her if she didn't. She used a no-till drill afterward to slice narrow slits through that mat, dropping seed directly into undisturbed ground beneath it, soil that hadn't been turned in years, and had built up a depth and structure she hadn't fully appreciated until she knelt down one evening and dug a handful up just to look at it. Dark, loose, threaded through with more earthworms than she'd ever seen in one place on the property, moving through soil that smelled like something alive rather than simply dirt. Wade's fields, by contrast, stayed exactly what the valley considered proper, bare, black, meticulously turned, clean enough to eat off of by June. The first real crack in the mockery came after an ordinary summer storm dumped nearly 3 inches of rain on the county in a single afternoon. Standing water showed up in low spots across half the valley's conventionally farmed fields, some of it sitting for days before it finally soaked away or evaporated. Nora's lowland flooded too, briefly, but instead of pooling and sitting, the water spread evenly across the grass and old channels, soaking in noticeably faster than anywhere else she could see. She'd started keeping her own measurements by then, a habit picked up straight from her grandfather's old notebook, timing how long standing water took to disappear in different sections of the property. Wade came by 2 days later, not to gloat, just to look. He stood at the fence line studying ground that had taken on 3 inches of rain and showed no sign of it now beyond slightly greener grass. How deep did it get? He finally asked. About 8 inches, out past the old channel, Nora said. Gone in under 2 days. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't laugh either, and Nora understood that was its own kind of progress with a man like Wade. She got a more public chance to prove it at the county fair that August, standing at a folding table she'd set up more on impulse than planning. 2 mason jars in front of her, one filled with a clod of soil from her own unploughed ground, one from a conventionally tilled field a neighbor had let her sample. Gus Pruitt happened to be walking past with a funnel cake when he noticed her and slowed down, more out of curiosity than anything, a couple of other fairgoers drifting over behind him. Watch what happens, she told the small crowd that had gathered, mostly out of curiosity about what the Hayes girl was doing with jars of dirt. She dropped both clods into water at the same moment. The tilled soil dissolved almost immediately, clouding the water brown, falling apart into loose sediment within seconds, drifting down in a slow gray cloud until the water looked more like weak coffee than anything with structure left in it. Her own sample held its shape, water clearing around it, while the clod itself stayed largely intact, structure holding the way a sponge holds its shape rather than crumbling. That's called a slake test, Nora explained, to a crowd that had gone a little quieter than she expected. Soil with roots and structure left in it holds together. Soil that's been broken up every year falls apart the second real water hits it. Gus leaned in close to the jars, squinting at the difference like he half expected it to be some kind of trick. That's not two different kinds of dirt. Same valley. Same rain last month. Near enough. Difference is what's been growing in it, and what hasn't been turned over every spring. Nora held his gaze evenly. You asked me back in April if I was keeping a lawn, Gus. This is what the lawn's actually doing. He didn't have a ready answer for that, and moved on a few minutes later without saying much else, though Nora noticed he glanced back at the jars twice on his way out. Wade was standing near the back of the small crowd the whole time. He didn't say anything that day either, but he stayed and watched both jars along while after most everyone else had moved on to the next booth. The financial pressure came in September, and it came from her own father rather than any neighbor. Nora. Roy sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, papers spread in front of him that she recognized, with a sinking feeling, as the farm's operating numbers. We're behind where we need to be. That 20 acres not producing anything is real money we don't have room to keep leaving on the table. I know it meant something to your grandfather. I need it to mean something to the bank account too, or we're going to lose considerably more than 20 acres by spring. Give me till after harvest, Nora said. If the numbers still don't work by then, I'll plow every foot of it myself. Roy looked at her a long moment, tired in a way that went beyond one bad night's sleep. That's a hard thing to ask a man who's already scared about how we make it through winter. I know. Nora didn't have a better answer than that, and the conversation ended without either of them fully satisfied, the 20 acres fate hanging unresolved between them for the first time since she'd made the decision back in April. The forecast that changed everything arrived 2 weeks later. A tropical storm remnant tracking inland, carrying rainfall totals the county extension office described, without much hedging, as potentially historic. Farmers across the valley began harvesting early, reinforcing creek banks, pumping drainage ditches ahead of a storm nobody wanted to underestimate twice in one generation. Wade came by the Hayes place himself that week, more serious than Nora had ever seen him. You should plow that low field now, he told her. If this storm's half what they're saying, you're going to lose the crop either way. At least plowed, you'd have salvage value in the ground before the water takes it. Nora thought about it longer than she wanted to admit, standing at the fence with a storm bearing down and her father's worried numbers still sitting on the kitchen table at home. But the notebook's final line about the low ground kept surfacing in her mind, clearer than any argument Wade or her own fear could make against it. When the river rises, let the low ground take it. I'm not plowing it, Wade, she said. Not now? Especially not now. He didn't understand her answer, and didn't pretend to, but something in his expression told her he wasn't going to fight her on it either. The rain started that Thursday night, and didn't stop for 4 days. By the second day, the creek had left its banks entirely, spreading across low ground throughout the valley in a slow, relentless sheet. Nora watched from the porch as water crept toward the property, fences disappearing beneath brown current, the sound of it a constant low roar that made sleep nearly impossible for anyone within a mile of the water. Roy stood beside her most of that evening, saying little, the two of them watching a storm neither one had ever seen the equal of in their lifetimes. Your grandfather ever see anything like this? Nora asked. Once. The year before I was born. Roy's voice was quiet, watching the water the way a man watches something he can't do anything about. He didn't like talking about it much. I always figured that's just how he was. Now I wonder if it wasn't something heavier than that. On the third night, at the worst of it, Nora stood on the porch convinced she'd made the wrong decision after all. The lowland was completely submerged, no different in that moment from any conventionally farmed field drowning right alongside it. Whatever her grandfather's system had been built to do, it looked, in the dark, exactly like every other piece of ground in the valley. Simply gone, taken by water that didn't seem to care what anyone had planted or protected. She thought about Wade's warning at the fence line. About her father's numbers spread across the kitchen table, and for the first time since April, genuinely wondered if she'd cost her family everything over a dead man's cryptic notebook. By dawn on the fourth day, something had changed that took Nora a while standing at the fence to fully understand. The water wasn't advancing through her property the way it was through the fields on either side of her. It was spreading sideways, into the old grassland, slowing as it hit ground built specifically to absorb exactly this. The old channels, cleared by her own hands that spring, were running full and steady, carrying water toward the wetland at the bottom of the property instead of letting it pool and batter everything in its path. The lowland had become, more or less exactly as the century-old survey described, a temporary basin, vast, brown, churning, but contained in a way the raw floodwater elsewhere in the valley wasn't. Nora stood at the fence in the gray early light and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Thursday night. Then her father's radio, tuned to the county emergency channel out of habit more than expectation, carried a report that changed the morning entirely. Water was rising fast along Miller Road, threatening the small cluster of houses near the old bridge. The same downstream stretch, Nora realized with a cold drop in her stomach that her grandfather's system had been built, over a century earlier, to protect. One of the old channels had to be blocked. Nothing else explained why water that should have been draining steadily through the system was instead backing up toward a section of the valley never meant to take this much of it at once. Nora found Wade already out checking his own damaged fields when she reached him, breathless, explaining what she needed as fast as the situation allowed. He didn't argue or question her the way he might have a season earlier. He just grabbed a shovel from his truck bed and followed her into water that reached waist deep by the time they'd crossed half the distance to the old spillway. They found it exactly where the 1911 survey suggested it should be. A stone channel choked with decades of fallen brush and debris, water backing up hard against the blockage instead of moving through it the way the whole system depended on. "We clear this by hand," Nora shouted over the roar of water, "or it backs up until it breaks through somewhere it was never built to." They worked together in current strong enough to test both their footing, hauling debris free piece by piece. Wade's strength doing work Nora's alone couldn't have managed in time. Nora lost her footing once, current pulling her sideways hard enough that she went under for a terrifying second before Wade's hand closed around her arm and hauled her back up, both of them gasping, neither one saying anything about it beyond a quick nod before they went back to clearing. It took the better part of an hour, both of them soaked and shaking with cold and effort, before the last major obstruction, a tangle of fallen branches wedged so tightly against the stonework that it took both of them pulling together to finally work it loose, gave way. Water roared through the cleared channel with a force that nearly knocked them both off their feet, a sound Nora felt in her chest more than heard. The current visibly changing direction within seconds as the pressure that had been building against the blockage finally found somewhere to go. Wade stood chest deep in the current afterward, breathing hard, looking at the water moving the way it was supposed to move for what might have been the first time in his own lifetime. Within minutes, the flood level along Miller Road, according to the same radio report Nora's father relayed to her by phone the moment he heard it, began dropping instead of climbing. The full scope of the damage became clear only once the water finally receded, for days after it first started. Neighboring farms across the valley had lost feet of topsoil in places, freshly plowed fields reduced to gullied, rocky wasteland that would take years and real money to recover from. Fences were gone entirely in some stretches. A section of county road had washed out completely. Nora's fields, though flooded in places just like everyone else's, were still there when the water pulled back. The unploughed lowland had taken the worst of it and held its shape regardless, roots and structure keeping soil in place that would otherwise have washed downstream along with everything else in the valley. Walking the lowland a few days later, Nora found something the flood itself had uncovered, a section of ground stripped bare by the retreating water, revealing a row of old stones she hadn't found in her spring digging, then a rotted wooden post, then the unmistakable remains of what had once been a small measuring station. Inside a rusted metal box wedged beneath the collapsed structure, protected just enough from the weather, she found decades of her grandfather's handwritten flood records, water levels, dates, careful notes going back to a year that made her sit down hard in the mud once she worked out the date. He'd been recording this the whole time, quietly, for the better part of his adult life, documenting exactly how much water that 20-acre lowland could hold and exactly how well it had worked, year after year, without ever once telling anyone what he was actually keeping track of. County engineers came out within the month, once word of what had happened at the Hayes place reached the right offices. They compared Elmer's decades of handwritten records against the flood data from the storm, and the numbers matched close enough that one of the engineers told Nora, plainly, that her grandfather's measurements were more accurate than half the modeling the county itself had on file. The county began looking into restoring other pieces of the old watershed after that, quietly at first, then with real funding once state disaster relief money became available for exactly this kind of resilience project. Other farmers in the valley started asking questions they'd have laughed off a season earlier. Wade was the first. He showed up at the Hayes place one morning that following spring with an old survey map spread across his truck's tailgate. "Found an old channel marked on my south field," he said. "Never noticed it before. Spent 40 years farming right over top of it without once asking why the ground did what it did there." He looked out toward Nora's lowland, green again, water moving quiet through the restored channel. "I stood in that water with you back in the storm and pulled brush out of a hole in the ground and didn't understand half of what I was doing it for. Understood enough by the time Miller Road stopped flooding, though. You want to help me figure out where it goes?" Nora asked, meaning his channel. "Figured I'd ask you that, actually, seeing as you're the one who knows how to read it." "Sure," Nora said. And that was the whole exchange worth remembering. No gloating, nothing to prove anymore. Just two neighbors looking at the same kind of map that had started all of it for her a year earlier. The last page in her grandfather's original notebook, written not long before he died, was one Nora hadn't fully understood until that spring, standing at the edge of the same field where Wade had once laughed at her for refusing to plow it. "Folks will call it wasted land because it isn't producing a crop. I always knew that. Knew too that someday this valley might need it to do a different kind of work. Land isn't wasted because it isn't producing. Sometimes its job is to keep the crop beside it alive." The grass was tall again that spring, clover blooming through it the way it had the year before, water moving slow and steady through a channel that had held when it mattered most. Beyond the lowland, on higher ground, the family's actual crop grew the way crops always had in that valley. Except this year, for the first time and longer than anyone could say for certain, the whole system beneath it was finally working the way it had been built to a century earlier. Nora hadn't refused to farm those 20 acres. She'd been farming them differently the whole time, the same patient way her grandfather had, without ever fully explaining why until the valley needed it enough to finally understand. If a story like this, where the land everyone called wasted turns out to be the reason the rest of the valley had somewhere to survive, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever trusted something you didn't fully understand simply because someone you loved asked you to, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.